Welcome, welcome everyone. My name is Lily Mendoza. Thank you all for coming, for being here. This event is hosted by CASE OU, Campus Alliance for Sustainability and the Environment. For those of you who are coming, who are joining us for the first time, we are a multi-sectoral coalition of faculty, staff, students, and community members passionate about building a culture of sustainability on campus and beyond. Today, especially with the growing escalation of Israel's war into Lebanon, threatening to break into a wider regional war, we've decided to offer a two-part series we've titled Gaza Beyond the Mainstream Narrative to make sense of the catastrophe and chaos, one that the world can ill afford, given the ongoing planetary climate crisis, auguring what scientists are calling the sixth great mass extinction. So to help us with this endeavor, we are fortunate to have with us an eminent scholar and prescient thinker, Dr. Alan Epstein. And he will be giving us talk in two parts. The first, the partnership casting light on US support for Israel, and the second, the environmental Nakba in Gaza, the challenges of healing. Dr. Alan Epstein is a former political science faculty here at OU and is a member of our steering committee, CASE OU steering committee. Alan earned his PhD from Cornell University, where he majored in comparative government with a focus on China. Noting in an interview the transformative impact of his undergrad studies and his exposure to such matters as international, political, economy, colonialism, absurdist literature, and contemporary Chinese political history, he remarked, "The world suddenly grew far more complex, interesting, and fathomable." He spent some 7 years living in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the mainland, and learning Mandarin while researching his doctoral dissertation. And back in the US, under the guidance of a mentor in Southeast Asian studies, he learned to read declassified US government documents, mainly about US interventions in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Alan's students have only words of deep respect and admiration for him, referring to him as compassionate, awesome, and a walking encyclopedia. When asked about his hope, this is what he said: that there will be a rekindling of sustained compassion for the other, without which little can consciously be done to address the dehumanizing burdens shouldered by too many. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Epstein.
Well, thank you, Lily. It's always strange to hear your words thrown back at you like that, but thank you very much. Before we begin, I'd really like to thank Lily, Jim Perkinson for helping to work out the details of this afternoon's event. Dean Masters sitting in the back, who, despite being under the weather today, has been instrumental in helping to set up the technology. And our dear colleague, Jane O'Neill, who couldn't be with us today because she's on a road trip, but Jane went above and beyond and helped craft the event flyer. So thank you to you all. You're fine. Before we begin, I would just like to say that, I think we're here in small numbers in this room, but more on Zoom. And thank you, Zoomers, for being here because of, as Lily said, what's been going on in the Middle East and the tremendous loss of life and suffering. And it seems only appropriate that we act respectfully and put ourselves in a respectful frame of mind by just taking a very short moment of silence to put ourselves there. So if you would join me just for a brief moment. Thank you. Thank you. Before I begin, let me offer a caution about the presentation, for which I prepared probably twice as many slides as is recommended for a talk of this length. So I'll be going through many of them very quickly and selectively, but they will be posted on the case website, hopefully on YouTube at some point. So they'll be there for your use if you would like to see them again. Also, many of the slides are very densely packed with text, exactly what you're not supposed to do in a PowerPoint presentation. But I've done this because there's lots of evidence. I've used a lot of quotations. I won't go through all of them, but they're there for your perusal as well. And I have also made the decision to put the sources of the information directly in the text on the slides rather than put them in a works cited page at the end, because I know people don't look at those, but I want you to look at these. So bear with me, if you will. And while the title today is the partnership casting light on US support for Israel, I will spend at least half the presentation talking about the United Kingdom, Great Britain, since I want to contextualize the very extensive deep roots of the US-Israeli partnership by going back in time and looking at what Britain had done. So a lot of what I'll have to say will seem irrelevant to what the title is, but in fact it has deep relevancy. At least I hope it does. In terms of an analytical focus, it's very easy to get carried away by the grisly details that are coming out of the Middle East. Human beings taken hostage and held for ransom. According to the rector of the University of Glasgow, Gassama Busita, argues that the war in Gaza has had a record number of pediatric amputations. At least 1,000 children have lost one or two legs from just October through December of last year. It's beyond unspeakable, given that most of these are occurring now without benefit of anesthetic or antiseptic, more akin to a Civil War field hospital than a modern medical procedure. I think if we only look at that, we depoliticize the conflict by failing to look at the deeper roots and the general causes of why this is happening, which is how I want to approach today's talk, but looking at one aspect of that in terms of the partnership. No doubt there are many others, but I'm looking at just one. So we need to go beneath the conflict to look at what I'm calling the partnership between Israel and the United States. My argument will not be strictly presented, but if you listen carefully, you'll note some themes that occur throughout. One is that this partnership is grounded on the vulnerability, first of the Zionist movement, and then of the Israeli state. And that the dependency in which the Israelis and the Zionists have on a larger great power patron versus the British and the United States creates a kind of insurance that they will do an expected service in return for protection. There's a kind of imperial service contract here whereby the smaller junior partner will be protected in exchange for doing some services for the larger partner or the patron. And that is much emphasized in the second half of the talk. I'd like you also to pay careful attention to the way in which there's a kind of ideological glue that holds the partnership together, which is something of a civilizational narrative in which both the partner, the US, and the junior partner, Israel, and the Zionist movement justify their actions in terms of defending civilization. This may sound just a sort of clichéic use of phraseology, but it has real implications in terms of how they understand the other, and mainly how they understand Arab neighbors, and most especially the Palestinians. And finally, I'll argue that in terms of the US-Israeli partnership, the wherewithal by which Israel is empowered to do its policing and other service work has made it able to essentially skirt over the core factor that drive the Greece part.
Whatever.
Also is able to, by choice, not seriously engage in negotiations that could push a resolution of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Before I begin, I have to offer a definition of a very important term, which is highly controversial, but I think honesty demands that I tell you how I understand the term, which is Zionism, but more specifically, Jewish political Zionism. I understand this term as a belief in the national oneness of all Jewish people predicated on assumed ancestry, assumed common ancestry, and calling for an ingathering of world Jewry to Arab-majority Palestine, the ancestral religious homeland, for the purpose of establishing a Jewish-ruled nation-state. As a political ideology joined to a national, and as I'll try to demonstrate, a colonial project, Zionism is not to be confused, in my judgment, with Judaism as a religion, with Judaism as a systematic compilation of ethics and morals. It's something quite distinct, though that remains very controversial. All right, so in a very glib way, let me first talk about the importance of Christianity to Jewish political Zionism. In the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, there was a systematic re-examination by theologians of religious texts and a reacquaintance of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinical commentaries. And some began to make a break from medieval church fathers by arguing that rather than posit the Jews as a pernicious source of unremitting evil, that in fact they held key to the redemption of Christian believers. And this stems from the fact that they believed that the second coming of Christ would not be possible without the restoration of Jews to the Holy Land, the restoration of Jews to Palestine, which cast the Jews in a very different light. In Europe, this became known as evangelical Christian restorationism, and as we'll see very shortly, this became very influential in British politics in the early 19th century. Okay? I realize I've just taken something highly complicated and reduced it to a sentence, but essentially that's what we need to do today. In this map by the German cartographer and theologian Heinrich Bunting, he offers a highly idealized representation of the world with, if you can see it, the centerpiece is Jerusalem or the Holy Land, and Europe, Asia, and Africa, the continental trio, if you like, are connected to the Holy Land. For later grand strategists, this became something of an assumption that if one controlled the Holy Land, if one controlled Palestine, they would have access to the continental crossroads, to the crossroads of empire. And one early exponent of this was Napoleon Bonaparte, who in the late 1790s, acting on behalf of revolutionary France, began a campaign to displace the Ottomans and their British backers in the Holy Land. And in Accra, or on the outskirts of Accra, which is today in northeastern Israel, he drafted a letter, some call it a proclamation, in 1799, to be issued when he marched into Jerusalem. And this letter was an invitation for European Jews to return to the Holy Land. And the implication was that in so doing, they would return for the first time since 70 CE, the diaspora would end, but revolutionary France would have in the Holy Land a European population with which to serve as a kind of fulcrum for further advances in the creation of a French empire, especially in displacing the British as far away as India in the east. Napoleon was not successful. He was defeated at Accra and had to leave the Holy Land. But this idea of utilizing Jews in their being restored to the Holy Land for geostrategic imperial purposes began to take root. We see this in the 1830s in Great Britain, where the notion of Christian restorationism reaches a high water mark, particularly with people like Lord Shaftesbury, who was otherwise probably unknown to you, but he was a very strong proponent of Christian restorationism. And he happened to be the son-in-law of Viscount Palmerston, who in the 1830s to the 1860s was arguably the single most important man running British foreign policy, and that he was both at various times the foreign minister and the prime minister. And he was appealed to on both religious and on imperial grounds to support the restoration of the Jews. He himself was not a restorationist. But we can catch a flavor of how intellectual culture in Britain began to change by looking at an excerpt from an 1839 editorial in the Globe newspaper, which I'll read in part. Jewish settlement in Palestine would free them from persecution in Europe and enable them to fulfill their historic role as agents of civilization in the Middle East. So here we have the notion of civilization, by which the writers mean Christianity, as having the Jews restored would be good for Christianity, giving Christians a security through the Jewish people by being restored in Palestine. In 1840, the British, along with Austria and the Ottoman Empire, were facing a challenge from an upstart Egyptian ruler, Muhammad Ali, or Mehmet Ali, who was attempting to displace the Ottomans and the British backers in the Holy Land. And there was a signal battle at Accra, that city that I mentioned just a moment ago, in which the British Admiral Charles Napier, using a coal-fired gunboat, bombarded the magazine or the arms depot at Accra and blew it up, and thereby forced the Egyptians to leave and securing Ottoman rule with their British backers in the Holy Land. We might add that this use of coal-fired gunboats was signal in helping to promote fossil fuels throughout the world, and that the British will then use coaling stations throughout the region and elsewhere to push the use of coal. More on that in a moment. But the defeat of the Egyptians at Accra opened the way for the British to exercise greater influence in Palestine. And here we have an excerpt from a communication from Foreign Minister Palmerston to his envoy in Constantinople, which he says in part, "It would be extremely politic if we could make the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, give them every encouragement, that is, to give them, meaning the Jewish people, every encouragement and facility for returning and buying lands in Palestine. And if they were allowed to make use of our consuls and ambassador as the channel of complaint, that is to say, place themselves virtually under our protection." Some argue that this is the original formula for the British colonization of Palestine, in the sense that the British would set up a protectorate for restored Jews to Palestine and use that for their geopolitical interests in the region and beyond. They could defend themselves in Egypt and as far away as in the east with their most important colony, India. So the combination of civilizational protection, Christianity, and imperial interest become a kind of formula for subsequent efforts to restore the Jews to Palestine. And it becomes an important understanding of the Jews themselves when they begin to think about their own efforts to have not just a homeland, but a state in Palestine, in ancient Israel. Yes?
Is there a way to play in slideshow?
There is, but if we do that, it will not show up on Zoom, which is why we're not going full screen. Yes. Still the case, Dean?
The column on the left a little narrower.
Okay, and how would I do that?
Stick to the edge of that dragon thing.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. How are we doing, Dean? Still showing up? Okay. Okay. With that move, I exhausted all my technological expertise, so please don't expect anything more. Okay. So Theodor Herzl, of course, is regarded as the founding father of Jewish political Zionism. His 1896 book, Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, was seminal in sparking a movement for Jewish return to the Holy Land and creating a Jewish state. Herzl was a Budapest-born Viennese journalist, minor playwright, and what else? Lawyer. And in 1894-95, he attended the trial of Alfred Dreyfus in France, the Jewish army captain who was wrongfully accused of treason, convicted and sent to Devil's Island, and which sparked a mass wave of anti-Semitism in Europe. And this was very discouraging for Herzl, who believed that the only way for Jews to survive as a people was to have a state of their own. This was occurring at a time of rising nationalism in Europe, where peoples living under colonial rule or under empire were thinking about having their own self-determination, the Jewish people were just added to the list as another people expecting the same thing. The difference for them was that these were a people who had, again, since 70 CE, were living in diaspora all over the world. They had no land of their own. They had no sovereign control of any place in the world. They were always a subdued or subjected minority. So the question was how to acquire land for a state. And this required, as far as Herzl was concerned, to find a great power colonial patron who could provide them the land. And ultimately, the movement, which is very small, it is not widely accepted by Jewish people initially, most of whom are interested more in becoming citizens of their own country or where they found themselves, having equal rights, than going to some faraway dusty place and reestablishing a homeland there. And ultimately, Herzl will find, or he will not himself find a patron, but ultimately the movement will find a patron in, of course, Great Britain. But let me give you a flavor of Herzl and the early Zionist attitude towards this project, reading in part from Der Judenstaat. If His Majesty, meaning the Sultan, if His Majesty, he's talking to fellow Zionists, not to the Sultan. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So again, Herzl, like the earlier Christian restorationists, saw the project as one of providing a service to an imperial patron. They would defend Western civilization, including defending the Christian holy sites in the Holy Land, in exchange for having some sort of property, land of their own with which to form a state. It is a conditional, it is a partnership. Just to read one more passage to get a flavor of this from Herzl's, this is from Herzl's diary, actually. If it is God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, we should like to do so as representatives of Western civilization and bring cleanliness, order, and the well-established customs of the Occident to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. So you see the Herzl as a European is saying that, as we'll see with other slides, that while the Jews were certainly originally from the Orient, they are now identifying themselves as coming from the Occident and offering their services to protect civilization against the barbarous other. We see the combination of the civilizational narrative as well as imperial service from a very important Zionist who follows Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, who will become the first president of Israel. Weizmann, as we'll see, was the most important mover and shaker for the Balfour Declaration, which I'll talk about in a moment. And he writes, should Palestine fall within the sphere of British influence, and should Britain encourage a Jewish settlement there as a British dependency, we could have in 25 to 30 years about 1 million Jews out there, perhaps more. They would develop the country, bring back civilization to it, and form a very effective guard of the Suez Canal, and perhaps be a valuable protection against an aggression from Constantinople. Palestine could easily become an Asiatic Belgium in the hands of the Jews. So the combination of this civilizational service as well as the idea of providing imperial service as well. This idea of civilizational service continues to the present day. I have numerous examples. Let me just offer you one that comes from 2017 with the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu talking privately on an open mic that he didn't realize was open in Central Europe, argued Israel, that is, we are part of the great European culture. Europe ends in Israel. East of Israel, there is no more Europe. We have no greater friends than the Christians who support Israel around the world. The Jewish state is the one democracy in the Middle East, a beacon of tolerance and a bastion of European and Western values in the heart of a very, very dark area. So my point is to see this through line that goes from the 17th century straight through to the contemporary period. Okay. Going back to the early 20th century, with Great Britain. We have the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. In 1912, Churchill makes a very consequential decision to switch from the use of coal to power the British Navy to the use of oil, in part because oil provides a better accelerant for the British Navy, but also because it reduces Britain's dependency on coal, which is subject to the interdiction of striking Welsh coal miners, which drove Churchill crazy. So there's a class warfare element here as well. But by switching to coal, Churchill realized, as he says, we must become the owners, or at any rate, the controllers, not merely buyers, at the source of at least a proportion of the supply of natural oil which we require. This caused the British Treasury to buy a major stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the forerunner of British petroleum today. As we'll see, that oil company will play a very major role in U.S.-Iranian relations in a couple slides from now. Because of this decision to switch to oil for the British fleet, which was the core of the British Empire, Palestine acquires added significance for Britain. This brings us to the Balfour Declaration. The British cabinet on November 2nd, 1917, issued a letter which becomes known as the Balfour Declaration, named after its foreign secretary, Arthur James Balfour. Arthur James Balfour was a very strong Christian restorationist and a rank anti-Semite, showing that you could be both at the same time. Because if the Jews were restored to Palestine, well, you get rid of them from Europe and you solve the Jewish question. One way to do that. The letter is issued to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild of the famous Rothschild family, who was the titular leader of the Zionist community in Great Britain and a very close friend of Chaim Weizmann. Let me just read you the 67 words that make up the substance of the declaration and pause every now and then to emphasize some language. The letter says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. The point is that the British, which at this point do not actually own Palestine or are even there yet, they will be in a month or so, are offering the Jews their best efforts to create a homeland there without consulting or asking the majority population who was already there, who of course the Arab Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim. And they are not even identified in this declaration. They're simply indirectly referred to as the existing non-Jewish community. So they're not even given the benefit of being identified, which, as we'll see, is quite intentional. And those communities are offered not sovereign collective political rights, but more minor religious and civil rights. Not that there's anything wrong with such rights, but they don't compare to the rights being offered to the Jewish community. Why would the British do this? Well, in part, there's a war still going on in Europe. The Central Powers are fighting the Allied powers, and there's concern that the Americans and the Russians are going to leave and not fight. And based on a trope about Jews being small but influential, the hope is that by rewarding the Jewish people with the promise of a homeland, American Jews and Russian Jews will somehow lobby their respective governments to keep them in the war. As well, of course, this satisfies the desires of the Christian restorationists and those who also want to solve the European problem with the Jewish presence by having them leave and go to Palestine. And most especially, it suggests that the British understand that they can have a strategic foothold at the continental crossroads from which to secure the Suez, which was established in 1867, and the overland routes to India, their crown jewel in the east. One very interesting quotation is from the second military governor general of Jerusalem for the British, Sir Ronald Storrs, who in his memoir written in 1837 explains what the British expected of this Jewish homeland, which I'll read just in part, where he says, it would provide for England a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism, meaning that just like King James I in the early 17th century, in which he encouraged English and Scottish settlers to move into the northern part of Ireland, which was restive with unhappy Catholic Irish who were not willing to live under British dominion, but they could establish a kind of quiet space, a pro-monarchist quiet space. This is what Storrs argues that Britain expected of the Jews in a Jewish homeland, to create a quiet space for British interests in a sea of otherwise potentially hostile Arabism. The significance I've sort of discussed. It's the first formal commitment by a government to a Jewish homeland. And for the Arab majority, it's a form of political erasure, actual juridical erasure, in the sense that they are not named, they are not consulted, they are not giving their consent. They're simply being compelled to accept what they would otherwise not find acceptable. And we know they wouldn't find it acceptable because after the Balfour Declaration's issuance, every November 2nd in Palestine until 1947-48 was a day of mourning in Palestine, as both Christians and Muslim Arabs thought this was a tragedy that was befalling them. And now for someone you've never heard of, but need to know something about. Zev Jabotinsky, otherwise known as Vladimir Jabotinsky, born in Odessa, today Ukraine. Jabotinsky was a very important Zionist and a very honest Zionist, in that he understood that if there's going to be a Jewish homeland, nay, a Jewish state, that this is going to require an act of colonization. He's very explicit. He says, look, our aim as Zionists is to transform Palestine into the land of Israel, and with it a dominant Jewish majority. No longer will Jews be a suffered minority. We're going to be in control. But this requires that we need to become dominant in an area where we really have no place at the moment. And we need to colonize that place. And we will expect resistance because everywhere around the world, people resist colonial imposition, whether it's in Australia with the so-called Aborigines or in the North American plains with the Native Americans here. Everyone does not like having someone else displace them and dominate them. So Jabotinsky argued, in order for this to happen, the Zionists need an iron wall. They need either naked military force in their own hands, or they need the support of a great power patron who could do that for them. And this iron wall will mean that opposition to their acquisition of land and massive immigration will not be able to be successfully challenged. This is the iron wall. But he's also said, if you read him carefully, he says, once the iron wall has been established and the native peoples realize the futility of further resistance, then we can begin discussions for coexistence. A coexistence predicated on a Jewish majority, but one which would allow certain rights for our Arab neighbors, mainly in the form of civil rights, as was discussed in the Balfour Declaration, but also a vague form of national rights, perhaps in the form of some kind of national autonomy, but not to become necessarily oppressively dominant, perhaps, but to find some way in which to coexist, but with the Jews on top.
When was it?
1923, Jabotinsky wrote two important essays in November of that month. Then, as I'll refer later to another important essay in 1934, but 1923, basically. So Jabotinsky was clear that while some Zionists argued, like Yitzhak Epstein, as far as I know, no relation, argued that we could win over the Arabs through good works and altruism, Jabotinsky found that inherently naive and argued instead that we need to have, again, the iron wall, either in our own hands or through a great power patron. But he also argues this in the last paragraph. In an era in which nationalism is rising, he said, he says, should Palestine remain Arab, Palestine would follow the orbit of Arab, that is, nationalist destinies. There'd be a federation of Arab countries and elimination of all traces of European influence, meaning the Arabs will catch the contagion of nationalism and they will throw out the Europeans. They will live under their own guise, and they will have Arab countries and Arab federation, which for Jabotinsky was something he could sell to a great power patron by way of fear. So he says, but a Palestine predominantly Jewish, Palestine as a Jewish state, surrounded on all sides by Arab countries, will, in the interest of its own preservation, always seek to lean upon some powerful empire, non-Arab and non-Mohammedan. This is an almost providential basis for a permanent alliance between England and a Jewish, but only a Jewish Palestine. In other words, given that a Jewish state would be surrounded by hostile neighbors, the assumption the Jews would always be loyal to their protector, in this case to England. They would always give loyal service in exchange for this protection. It was a guarantee that they would be a worthy cause for a patron such as Great Britain. However, okay, there we go. So, however, Jabotinsky's successors, including those who run Israel today, had a different idea of the Iron Wall. Rather than use it as a means for establishing coexistence, if we assume that was actually what Jabotinsky intended, they've used it instead to repress, to use the iron wall of their superior military force to engage in mass expulsions and the stubborn denial of juridical personhood. The resulting permanent condition of resistance and violence that has arisen from this imposition sustained the vulnerability of the subsequent Jewish state, and for that reason, its reliable service to needed great power patrons. They became and have become literal ramparts to protect Israeli Jews from perpetual existential crisis formed by the dispossession of the indigenous population and their quest for return and expected revenge. This idea of expected revenge is quite intense. It's identifiable in so many writings of subsequent Zionist and Israeli leaders. And it's, I think, very important to take note of. Let me just read you one lengthy passage by David Ben-Gurion, who will become, as we'll see under the British Mandate, the leader of the Jewish Agency and the first prime minister of the state of Israel. Here he's in private discussion with the president of the World Jewish Congress in a discussion in 1956, where he says, why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago, and what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They may perhaps forget in 1 or 2 generations. I'm sorry, they only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? They may perhaps in 1 or 2 generations' time, but for the moment there is no chance. So it's simple. We have to stay strong and maintain a powerful army. Our whole policy is there. Otherwise, the Arabs will wipe us out. The Iron Wall is not simply to repel. It is not simply to repel attack. It's also to address an important problem faced by the Jewish state, namely a demographic problem. That when the Jewish state is formed, the Jews are still a pronounced minority, as we'll see, only 30% of the population. And there was very serious concern that immigration alone would not counterbalance the Arab majority. So the idea of expulsion, which is euphemistically branded transfer, has been a very important component of Zionism and of Israeli policy from the beginning. Here, the important Jewish Israeli historian Benny Morris writes here, The idea of transfer is as old as modern Zionism and has accompanied its evolution and praxis during the past century. And driving it was an iron logic. There could be no viable Jewish state in all or part of Palestine unless there was a mass displacement of the Arab inhabitants who opposed its emergence and would constitute an active potential fifth column in its midst. This logic was understood and enunciated before and during 1948, the date of the founding of the State of Israel, by Zionist, Arab, and British leaders and officials. This takes us to the British Mandate. After World War I, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire as part of the Central Powers results in its previous territories, like Palestine, being divvied up among European powers, such as the British and the French. Palestine was identified as a Class A mandate by the League of Nations, newly established. And under Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, it was promised eventual self-rule as a sacred trust of the League. And as a Class A mandate, the feeling was that Palestine was highly developed and was, in effect, granted provisional independence, meaning it was on the cusp of being granted independence. We can talk about why they had to even have that recognition. Isn't just the desire to have it sufficient, but this is still the era of colonialism, and there's a different attitude here. However, the British agreement, which was written by the British as their, if you like, constitution, under which they would govern their mandate for Palestine, had in its preamble the verbatim text of the Balfour Declaration. And the mandate agreement that British wrote was in effect to operationalize the promise of the Balfour Declaration, to use the mandate to create a national home for the Jewish people. And this meant, of course, that the juridical erasure of the Palestinian nationality, their right to self-determination and self-governance, was consistently ignored, denied, and erased. Committed to establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine and a little loyal Jewish Ulster for Britain, the Mandate Agreement established embryonic institutions for the Zionist movement, paving the way for a future Jewish state and its domination of Palestinians and the surrounding region. The Balfour Declaration and the British mandate for Palestine becomes a kind of iron wall for the Palestinian majority. I won't go through some of these important provisions, except to note that while the Jewish community were offered certain governing institutions, which they would use to become adept at governance, establish international contacts around the world, and become formidable both politically, economically, and as we'll see, militarily, none were offered to the Arab majority. And perhaps most importantly, Article 6 commits the British under the mandate to facilitate Jewish immigration and encourage close settlement by Jews on the land, meaning the demographic and territorial domination of the Jewish community was actively promoted through this article in Palestine. Along with other provisions, we can argue the British mandate for Palestine again advantaged the Zionists over the invisibilized Arab majority, affecting a severe power imbalance that would contribute to the infamous Nakba of 1947 to 1949. The rise of the Nazis in the 1930s in Germany provoked a mass outpouring of Jews to Palestine. They were looking for a place to save themselves, quite understandably. But for the Palestinians, this was for them, if you like, the great replacement, not in theory, but in practice. And they regarded this with great bitterness, and they revolted against the British, who were not stopping it, but in fact were encouraging it. And the Great Revolt from 1936 to 1939 is arguably the most important development in Palestine in the interwar period, and resulted in a tremendous defeat for the Arabs. Begins as a 6-month general strike, arguably the longest in colonial history, and then an armed revolt up and down the breadth of Palestine. The Jewish Zionist community is enlisted by the British to help put down the revolt. Their militias are given military training, arms, and intelligence training, which very much helps them develop their iron wall capabilities. And at the end of the day, the revolt is put down very harshly, using all sorts of emergency measures, which Israel will incorporate in law in 1948, including the familiar collective punishments of home demolitions, deportations, executions for having ammunition and weaponry, detentions and imprisonment without trial or charge, and locking down entire villages and towns with curfews. At the end of the day, the estimates are that between 14 and 17% of all Arab males were either killed, wounded, imprisoned, or deported, and leaving them shattered and divided. The British did try to effect some negotiations to end the revolt, but it only exacerbated tensions. And I think I should just mention a few of these because it has a bearing on what we'll talk about in a moment. In 1937, the Peel Commission is formed, which proposes a partition of Palestine by offering the Jewish community 17% of the land for a Jewish state. The Jewish community thought that was far too little. The Arabs thought that was far too much, and so it went nowhere. In 1939, as Europe is poised for war again, for World War, Britain makes a very consequential decision. It decides to, in effect, shift its allegiance away from the Zionist community towards the Muslim community, understanding that Muslims around the world would need to be enlisted, especially in India, if Britain was to successfully fight a world war again, especially against the Germans. And so, to make a long story short, Britain sponsored a restriction on land sales, immigration of Jews in Palestine. And this infuriated the Zionists, thought this was a betrayal, and this will ultimately result in some of the Zionist community actually turning violently against their former British patrons. In Britain deciding instead to enlist the help of existing Arab states and to abandon their attempt to establish a little loyal Jewish Ulster in Palestine. However, by the time this occurs, the iron wall for the Zionist community had been built. Jumping around, after World War II, Britain, of course, is exhausted by the war. Its empire is falling apart. Peoples rising up for independence, some being negotiated, some being won by force. And Britain announces in spring of 1947 that it cannot continue with its mandate over Palestine. It needs to give it up. It says it will do so on May 14th of 1947, and by the following day, May 15th, all its forces will have been withdrawn from Palestine. The successor to the League of Nations, the United Nations, is concerned about what to do, and it's decided through a special commission that they will partition Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. The Jewish state will comprise 56% of the land, even though the Jews at the time represented only 30% of the population and physically control less than 7% of the territory. The Arab population will be granted 42% of the territory, even though they make up still 70% of the population and have most of the land under their control. There would also be an international city in Jerusalem and its environs, a corpus separatum governed by the United Nations. Please keep that in mind. Not to be governed by either the Jewish or the Arab state, but by the United Nations, given its significance to both peoples. The Palestinians insisted that the UN had no more authority to partition Palestine than had the League of Nations, then had the League or the British government to create a Jewish national home without their consent in the first place. It's interesting to note that the League's Special Commission, which proposed the partition, rejected claims that Article 22 of the League's covenant required independence as a sacred trust for all of Palestine, not for its division into two entities. And questions were raised about the legality of the United Nations General Assembly to even offer the idea of partition. And people wanted this to be brought for judgment before the newly established International Court of Justice, but this was refused. It's important to note, I think, that partition and the eventual creation of the Jewish state of Israel transpired at the sunset of the colonial period and at the dawn of anti-colonialism in the United Nations itself, creating legal vulnerability for Israel over its founding and its parastate period during the British Mandate. So again, I'm emphasizing the importance of vulnerability and this connection to great power, patronage, and partnership. Palestinians and neighboring Arab countries regarded partition as another form of colonialism. And as I mentioned before, the Zionists, at this time led by David Ben-Gurion, who would soon become Israel's first president, recognized that partition was but a first step. It was the Zionists had greater ambitions to acquire far more territory than the UN had allotted them. And they thought that would come eventually because of their superiority militarily, economically, and through their political connections. But what Ben-Gurion worried most about was the demographic problem, the fact that there were still a majority of Palestinian Arabs living in the territory designated for a Jewish state. And Ben-Gurion said, immigration will not counter that imbalance. And so he proposed that we'll have to face this fact and that expulsion will be what we'll ultimately have to do. We could arrest people, but we're ultimately going to have to expel them. And I'm arguing that this would add to the new state's legal security and political vulnerabilities in the anti-colonial era, reinforcing need for great power patronage. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly votes on UN General Assembly Resolution 181 and approves the partition of Palestine into two states. The US is instrumental in this vote, pressuring many smaller countries who initially opposed the partition, most especially putting heat on Haiti, the Philippines, and Liberia, three places that had been or were still seriously in the US orbit and were liable to such pressures. Like the partition proposal, passage occurred while ignoring the will of the indigenous majority, the legality of partition, and the UN's authority to table the idea of partition, again, reinforcing the legal, security, and political vulnerabilities for the future Jewish state. Once the vote happens, civil war breaks out between Palestinian Arabs and Zionist Jews. During the ensuing fighting, Zionist forces prove their mettle, they're better organized, they're better equipped because of the strength they gained during the British Mandate, and they are able to drive tens of thousands of Palestinian villagers out of the areas designated for the State of Israel. Over 720,000 of the 1.3 million Palestinians were made refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and what was then called Transjordan, or funneled into Gaza. Some 80% of those living in what was, again, designated for the Jewish state were removed. The resulting Palestinian casualties, statelessness, confiscated land and possessions by Zionist settlers, and the refusal of the new Israeli state to permit the refugees who had been displaced to return is known by Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. On May 14th, the day the British decided that they would end their mandate, the Zionist community unilaterally declares statehood, and the state of Israel is created. The first country to recognize the newly established state is the United States. But with that declaration of statehood, war ensues between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Contrary to conventional depictions of the war, Israel outgunned and outnumbered its Arab foes. only 2 of which actually crossed the frontier into the area designated for the Jewish state. In the course of the fighting, Israel took by force an additional 22% of the area designated for the Palestinian state, giving them a total of 78% of historic Palestine. Not to be outdone, Egypt grabs Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, Jordan, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And Israel takes, of course, West Jerusalem. Again, both in contravention of UN Resolution 181's call for Jerusalem to be a united international city under UN administration. Israel then applies for admission to the United Nations. Initially, it was denied because of its handling of Jerusalem and its refusal to allow refugees to return in violation of another General Assembly Resolution 194 passed in December of 1948. But eventually, Israel is admitted into the UN. But this occurs despite, again, denying Palestinian self-determination, taking territory by force in violation of the new United Nations Charter, Articles 1 and 2, and violating the Jerusalem and non-discrimination clauses of the Partition Resolution, as well as, again, the resolution calling for return of refugees or compensating them if they were unable or unwilling to return, and Article 13 of the newly passed Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which calls for people to be able to leave their country or to return to it for any reason. The Nakba itself could have been included in the Genocide Convention passed on December 9th, but it was excluded as well. So my point in mentioning these things is that these exclusions will become matters of great contestation and sources, again, of vulnerability for Israel as UN membership expands and the General Assembly becomes less forgiving of colonial arrangements while questioning Israel's founding legitimacy and its practices. Okay, now we're getting to the partnership. The foundation of the State of Israel, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 also occurs at a time when Britain and France are losing their hold in the region, and the US is solidifying its hold. It's solidifying its hold because the region itself becomes a very important oil producer and exporter at this time. During World War II, the United States consumes over 1/3 of its oil reserves. The US had been a major oil producer, but it uses much of it up during the war. This alarmed President Roosevelt when his dying days met the King of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, on the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt outside the Suez Canal, and they struck a deal. We still don't know the exact details of the deal, but in outline, we're told it involves the Saudis granting the US access to oil supply in exchange for the US promise to protect Saudi Arabia. So oil for security. Every US president since, even Joe Biden, who promised he'd make Saudi Arabia a pariah, has endorsed that deal from 1945. In a State Department memo in August of that year, after the meeting, the memo says, maybe you've seen this, in Saudi Arabia, where the oil reserves constitute a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, a concession covering this oil is nominally in American control. That is to say, the State Department recognized that by having this relationship with Saudi Arabia, the US had unmatched power and access to stupendous wealth. And indeed, oil would become the foundation for the US empire after World War II. From 1950 to 73, thought to be the golden era, oil was on average from the region less than $2 a barrel, who can imagine? And the US used Marshall Plan aid to essentially transform Europe from reliance on coal to reliance on Middle East oil. The same would also happen to Japan subsequently. And this cheap energy and reliable supply becomes the core of US global domination, becomes a guarantor of the US dollar gold system. It it undergirds the golden age of world capitalism, and of course, it begins the great acceleration of carbon emissions as well. But the US at this time is also very worried about revolutionary nationalism in what we used to call the third world, today the global south, and in particular in the Middle East, they're worried about Nasserism, named after Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, and his promise to unite Arab peoples in pan-Arab nationalism and also promoting pan-Arab socialism. At this time, as I skip around, the US looks at Israel and sees that it has military potential, but it prefers to rely on the Arab states so as not to alienate them. So there is no partnership with Israel at this time. But this will change dramatically very soon. In 1951, the US fear of revolutionary nationalism comes to pass with an episode in Iran. The elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh decides to nationalize the oil sector, including the Anglo-Iranian oil company that Churchill had invested in back in 1912. This very much alarmed the Americans, who with their British counterparts in MI6, the CIA stages a coup in Iran, the first known CIA overthrowing of a government. And a year later, the New York Times celebrates this by talking about how this is an object lesson for third world leaders, not to mess around, not to go berserk with fanatical nationalism. But it showed the concern that a contagion could occur if one nation succeeded in taking control of its economy out of the hands of the West. This might spread, and this would be disastrous for the US and its allies. The significance of this was caught by the Israelis. The chief editor and publisher of the important Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Gershom Shokin, wrote in an editorial in September of 1951, he says, the feudal Arab regimes of the region, meaning the monarchies, the oil monarchies of the region, I'm going to read this in full, have to make such concessions to the nationalist movements in their midst, if you will, which sometimes have a pronounced socialist leftist coloring, that they become more and more reluctant to supply Britain and the United States with their natural resources and military bases. Therefore, strengthening Israel helps the Western powers to maintain equilibrium and stability in the Middle East. Israel is to become the watchdog. There is no fear that Israel will undertake any aggressive policy toward the Arab states when this would explicitly contradict the wishes of the US and Britain. But if for any reason the Western powers should sometimes prefer to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighboring states whose discourtesy toward the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible. So here, an elite Israeli is offering Israel services to the West, and the United States in particular, to act as their watchdog, act as their proxy in a hostile region. The magic moment comes in 1967 with the six-day attack by Israel on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel achieves a resounding military success, and in the course of doing so, especially by defeating Egypt so resoundingly, it discredits Nasserism and the idea of pan-Arab nationalism. And the United States was impressed by this. Even the minority leader in the House of Representatives, the future US President Gerald Ford, said Israel has done a pretty good job of bailing out US interests in the area, meaning at a time when the US is preoccupied in Southeast Asia, Israel went to bat and struck a blow against third world nationalism. So Israel is perceived now as a potential proxy that can serve US interests in the region and perhaps even beyond. So we might say, forming for America a little loyal Jewish outpost in a sea of hostile Arab nationalism, socialism, and later of Islamism. Israel, of course, in its military victory, takes control of the West Bank, which had been under control of Jordan, of East Jerusalem. Now they have all of Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and of course they had the Golan Heights from Syria. As many as 300,000 plus Palestinians are exiled again from the West Bank, known as the Naksa or the setback, and those remaining in the West Bank are now living under military rule, deemed illegal by most UN members. Again, occupation intensifies Palestinian national resistance to the Israeli state and finds enthusiastic support as an anti-colonial cause within the non-aligned movement in the global south. Non-aligned movement meaning former colonies in Africa and in Asia. So again, the US need for a pro-America, stable military power in the region to help safeguard American and Western oil interests against Arab socialists, anti-imperial nationalists, and assorted Western forces, and later political Islamists, found a willing partner in Israel, which was threatened by pariah status for its founding and for its settlement on Palestinian lands. As an anachronism in the unspooling anti-colonial age, Israel sought diplomatic protection from the US. Continued hostility by aggrieved neighbors and Palestinians made Israel very amenable to US military support. In exchange, Israel would provide a range of policing services in the region and support globally. And Israel's perception as living under perpetual existential threat ensured its reliable service, as Jabotinsky had conceived way back in the day. This would help America to avoid imperial overstretch by allowing Israel to police a region deemed vitally important to the maintenance of the US as a world power. And it would give Israel the wherewithal to dominate the region and the Palestinians as well. But I note this. Ironically, vested with this wherewithal to avoid confronting the sources of enmity between itself and its neighbors, especially the Palestinians, Israel uniquely still finds need to defensively assert without prompting its right to exist. That is, I don't know if you've noticed this, but to my mind, Israel is the only country that will, out of the blue, talk about its right to exist. No other country does this. Every other country just assumes that it does. But given Israel's past and the way it's challenged on its founding and its policies, it's always sensitive to this matter. And having a strong military allows it to not pay attention to criticism, but it's clear that it still bothers them. It's still a concern. And for the US, it's more interested in Israel's continued service than to force it to compromise and reach some kind of understanding with its neighbors and the Palestinians. It's not to be, I think, underestimated the importance of US diplomatic protection for Israel. Even Israel's legal advisor, the foreign ministry, acknowledged that Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands violated Article 49 of the 14 of the conventions, which prohibits a occupying power for essentially deporting their people into or out of the territory which it occupies. The US will veto over 40 UN Security Council resolutions that are targeting Israel. I think the number is now 48. And it will also badger back through pressure over 100 General Assembly resolutions targeting Israeli policies and practices. The Israeli attitude towards the UN can be well summarized by its then ambassador to the United Nations, Yitzhak Rabin, the well-known defense minister, then prime minister, and the assassinated prime minister, who argued that that everything that takes place in the United Nations is meaningless as long as the United States does not support resolutions like those critical of Israel or supportive of Palestinian self-determination. These resolutions have no significance. If the US can silence them, then Israel doesn't have to pay attention to them. And they don't. After the Six-Day War, US military support to Israel increases, first slowly, and then it gushes. This is the annual amounts. I won't dally here except to say that they rise considerably. The United States insists that Israel maintain a qualitative military edge, meaning that It must be supplied with sufficient weaponry and defense capabilities so that it can always overcome any individual or combination of foes. This is now enshrined in US law. Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid since its founding. If we use inflation-adjusted dollars, about $310 billion. And today, Israel receives an annual allocation of $3.3 million in foreign military finance grants and an extra $500 million for missile defense research and development. This does not include the special appropriations for the wars now going on in Gaza, Lebanon, and perhaps elsewhere. Israel is also designated as a major non-NATO ally, which allows it certain privileges in the United States. And unique to any other recipient of US foreign aid, for a time, Israel was allowed to spend 26% of its aid on its own defense industry. Usually when you get money from the United States, it's tied aid. You must spend it on American products and American services. Israel was granted an exception. The US and Israel jointly conduct research and development on weaponry, and there's a pronounced integration with US and Israeli defense firms, like Elbit Systems in Israel. Today, nearly all US aid to Israel is in the form of military grants. It covers the equivalent of 16% of Israel's defense budget, allows them to spend over 5% of their GDP on the military, which is very large, comparatively speaking, and makes Israel the second largest per capita spender on the military in the world after Qatar, and have the fourth largest military in the Middle East after Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, and certainly more formidable than the last two. It's also true that from 1971 to 2007, Israel got lots of money for its economy, but that economy it also allowed Israel to spend lots of its money for military purposes and develop a very robust military industry, now ranking 9th in terms of military exports in the world. And 10% of Israel's exports come from the military sector. So we can say it's a highly militarized economy. And perhaps not by accident, since this very much suits the American purpose of having Israel serve as a policing force in the world. It might not be good for Israelis, but it's good for the United States. And what service has the US received? It's gotten all kinds of services in terms of defeating political Islamist movements in Jordan in 1970, in Lebanon in 1982, and perhaps today as well, and in Palestine ongoing. It's kept anti-American regimes in Syria, Iraq, and Iran in check. And this one is quite fascinating. It has supplied weaponry, technology, and training to regimes and movements too politically unpalatable for direct US engagement itself. So just referencing selectively, well, the United States had a hard time initially funding the Pinochet regime in Chile. There was nothing holding back Israel. Same thing for the Nicaraguan Contras, same thing for the Rwandan military and Hutu militias before and during the genocide, and most spectacularly, apartheid South Africa, with which Israel had very close relations for at least 2 decades. This also meant Iran under the Shah. It meant Indonesia under Suharto during the genocide of 1965, and at present Myanmar's An Min Long's repressive military regime there. In a 1993 speech to the Socialist International, Nelson Mandela stated, quote, "The people of South Africa will never forget the support of the state of Israel to the apartheid regime." You need to understand that if you want to know why it was South Africa that put forward a case against Israel for genocide in Gaza. There's a deep animosity about what was done. Since 1984, the US has pre-positioned lots of weaponry in Israel, transforming Israel into a kind of de facto US forward base, in addition to Secret Site 512, a radar facility located somewhere near Gaza. During the Cold War, Israel provided captured Soviet weaponry to the US, and since it supplied surveillance technology, arms, and assorted pacification techniques developed in its so-called Palestine laboratory. That is, the techniques and armaments that Israel uses to keep the Palestinians in check, it commercializes, sells around the world, and makes available to the US. Israel and the US share intelligence through Israel's Unit 8200, which is the equivalent of the National Security Agency, and they have engaged in joint covert operations against, say, Iran when they sabotaged the Iranian centrifuges a few years ago. Israel understands that its founding, its occupation, and its engagement with disruptive regimes has made it a kind of pariah. And on the one hand, it embraces that. It understands that that provides reliable service to the United States. I won't read all these quotes because of time constraints, but let me just read one. This by Yohanna Ramati, a former member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Likud government in Israel. He says, Israel is a pariah state. When people ask for something, we cannot afford to ask questions about ideology. The only type of regime that Israel would not aid would be one that is anti-American. Also, if we can aid a country that may be inconvenient for the US to help, we'd be cutting our nose to spite our face not to. So Israel understands that it has a role in serving regimes which the US cannot directly do for political reasons. We see this as well with the statement made by a retired Israeli general, Shlomo Gazit, who talked about how even after the Cold War, Israel remains a very important proxy for the West. The Cold War's end did not diminish Israel's service, it actually increased its importance. He says the West would have to perform interventionary services were it not for Israel. But the West cannot always do this for political reasons. It may be opposed domestically or internationally, so it falls to Israel to do this. And he says, for Israel, by contrast, the need to intervene is a matter of survival. We'll do it because it's not only helping you, but we need to do it for our own survival, so we're happy to do it. In short, 70 years after the Haaretz editorial talking about Israel's role as a watchdog, Israel's role has not changed. It continues to serve as a service agent for stability, but doing so in a region which is very unstable and maintaining repressive conditions as consequence, which generate conflict, as we see in Gaza, as we see in Lebanon, and points beyond. As the Haaretz article noted, other states in the region cannot perform this service because there is hostility to the United States. They cannot be a reliable proxy because their own people would not stand for it. But as this op-ed to the New York Times by an Israeli writer notes, reading the bold, and some of this is dated, but it still applies, I think, there is virtually no Israeli opposition to this global adventurism, to this interventionism. There is no human rights lobby to oppose military involvement in Guatemala, Haiti, or South Africa. There are no angry editorials or demonstrations when officials from repressive third world countries visit Jerusalem. The role of regional and global policemen is something that many Israelis find attractive, and they're ready to go on with the job, for which they expect to be handsomely rewarded. I think this still applies. I was going to play you this very short 30-second clip of Senator Joe Biden in 1986, where he's arguing on the floor of the Senate against a bill to provide military assistance to Saudi Arabia. We had difficulties with this, so I'm not going to risk it. But many of you have seen it. But he says, in effect, that Israel's utility is so great to the United States that if it didn't exist, the U.S. would have to invent Israel. We'd have to invent in Israel. And he repeats it several times. I mean, I've looked at this. He said this right up until the present day. He keeps saying this, which helps explain perhaps his own devotion to Israel, even though it plays him sometimes for a fool. Did I say that? Very quickly, the partnership has not been without tension. In the past, this has often involved Israeli military engagement, such as when Israel joined Great Britain and France to invade the Suez Canal in 1956, and the US was not happy with that and forced all three countries to retreat. In 1982, Ronald Reagan got on the phone and told the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to stop the shelling of Beirut, which he termed a Holocaust, which infuriated Begin, but he stopped. And more recently, the disagreements occur because the Israeli economy is now much more robust than it was back in the day. In 1981, US support for Israel made up 10% of Israel's GDP. Today, it's less than 1% because the economy is so much more powerful. So while the US is still a partner with Israel, there is rivalry. Unit 8200, again, this equivalent to the US National Security Agency, is a competitor and an ally of the United States. The 8200 unit spies on the US, spies on US allies, and the US apparently has some 350 people spying on it as they engage in a kind of constant chess match. And in 2021, the Biden administration decided to defend US technological superiority by putting 2 Israeli companies on its entity list, making it impossible for them to do business with American companies. One of them, the NSO Group, which produces the Pegasus software, which the very powerful spyware that is infamous around the world, and the lesser-known Kangaroo company, also in producing surveillance technology. The US justified this by saying that they're trying to crack down on repressive political technology. The Israelis said, ha ha ha, what you're really doing is trying to protect your own technological advantage by hamstringing some of our most important and cutting-edge companies. As well, the US has squashed Israel's defense relations with China. It had a robust commercial defense relationship where the US supplied all kinds of surveillance technology, drones, and other material to the Chinese. And the US said, no, you can't do that because China is our competitor. But Israel is still engaged commercially with China, which much worries the United States, in that they worry that Israel will sell China dual-use technology, which can be used by the Chinese to advantage themselves militarily with the United States. And so there's still a kind of chess match going on between the US and Israel over its relationship with China. So there are tensions. Very quickly, in 1987 to 93, the Palestinians had a major uprising, the so-called First Intifada, to shake off, and the Israelis could not pacify it. And the Americans got a little panicky, as did the Europeans, and they encouraged both sides to have a negotiation, which became known as the Oslo process. And Israel and the Palestinians reached a deal, which was very bad for the Palestinians, but this deal allowed Arab countries to tell their people that something was being done for the Palestinians. And so we should be less restrictive in our relations with Israel because they're making concessions, so we can too. But the Palestinians were not happy with this deal. The so-called final status arrangements over refugees and Jerusalem and settlements were not concluded by the deadline in May of 1999. And the Palestinian Authority, which becomes the ruling force in the West Bank, originally in Gaza as well, but no longer, is regarded by Palestinians as a disaster. They're regarded as not a governing structure which serves Palestinian interests, but which serves as a subcontractor for Israel by undertaking the policing of Palestinians on Israel's behalf, which is factually true. In the 2010s, we had the so-called Arab Spring, where Arab populations rose up against their governments, and in return, those governments made all kinds of deals with Israel for surveillance technology to keep their populations in check. So they grew closer together. And of course, in 2020, the so-called Abraham Accords and the Trump administration brought Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and ultimately Morocco into a joint understanding where there'd be mutual recognition in violation of an older understanding where the Arabs would not recognize or have peace with Israel until the Palestinian issue was resolved. President Biden, as you know, has an even broader vision for fully integrating the region, using Saudi Arabia as the centerpiece for economic and military integration, which would help further deter Iran. The thinking is it would also help marginalize China in the region, and it would allow Israel, by having more friendly relations with the Gulf monarchies, to more actively participate in their defense, which would in turn allow the United States to become less active there and complete its still incomplete so-called pivot to Asia, is the thinking. If we want to understand the Hamas attack on southern Israel on October 7th, there are many things to talk about. But part of it has to do with this economic integration project prior to the resolution of the Palestinian issue. The Saudis and others have promised that they would not engage in integration project until there was a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. But the Palestinians regard this as just pro forma talk, not serious. But for Hamas, they have talked about how they regarded this possibility of extensive normalization with Israel before the Palestinian issue had been resolved as an existential threat. And they've argued that they attacked in part to upset this apple cart. They've talked about this repeatedly, and indeed they have upset it, at least temporarily. For its part, Israel, of course, has engaged in a massive air and ground assault on Gaza to reestablish its deterrence, that is, its capacity to be feared, to repair its reputation within its own population, to exact revenge, and of course, to refurbish its brand, which I just want to briefly mention. The support by the United States and Israel's own abilities has created a very powerful player in the world, and especially in the region. And Israel has created its own little aura of a defiant little giant, willfully disregarding impediments to its security presented by stuffy international norms to successfully apply violence aimed at state and non-state rivals, encaging supernumeraries while claiming legal right or simply enjoying de facto impunity. This stance inspires and wins discreet admiration from proscribed, repressive, and disreputable regimes worldwide, expanding the range of otherwise unattainable diplomatic support while further insulating the country from political backlash to its occupation. Hungary loves Israel. Myanmar loves Israel because it can crush the people it needs to control and get away with it. And it does it with a kind of aplomb. Others, however, have noted that it's not just the politically unpalatable regimes that have bought into Israel's brand. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, a week after the Israeli response to October 7th, went on social media to issue a very inflammatory comment where he tried to understand why the West was so behind Israel in its slamming Gaza and why the global South was so against it. He tried to frame this by saying that what the West is doing is defending borders. And what the global South understands is that this spells doom for them. He writes, as I'll read in part, he says, "What we see in Palestine will be the suffering of all the peoples of the global South. The West defends its excessive consumption and its standard of living based on destroying the atmosphere and climate, and to defend it knowing it will cause the exodus, that is the migration from the South to the North, and not only of the Palestinian people." And going down here, what he terms the global 1933. In the global 1933, the life of humanity, and especially of the people of the South, depend upon the way in which humanity chooses the path to overcome the climate crisis produced by the wealth of the North. Gaza is just the first experiment to deem all of us disposable. This was not well received in these quarters. Last two slides. No applause, please. Israel's pulverization of Gaza has also made clear its continued dependence on the United States, its repeated requests for arms resupply, and its need for diplomatic cover, the repeated UN vetoes by the United States. And Israel defending its actions as a defense of civilization. When Netanyahu made his last appearance before a joint session of Congress here in July, he argued that we are doing this for you to defend civilization from barbarism. Again, that through line. But questions about Israel's utility and reliability have arisen because its security fence was penetrated, it suffered a very embarrassing defeat, or at least an embarrassing episode, which dented its brand. But the fire and fury rained on Gaza has also been calculated to refurbish this brand and this image. And that can also be understood by what's going on in Lebanon. Not entirely, but Israel is, by assassinating Hezbollah leaders like Nasrallah, they're also saying that, look, you cannot mess with us. We may have been dented once, but we're still tough. And indeed, just a day or two ago, Netanyahu was quoted in the Times of Israel saying, our enemies and friends are back to seeing Israel as it is, a strong, determined, and powerful country. Like the Intifada that gave rise to Oslo in a false delivery of Palestinian national rights, there's no indication that the American, European, and Saudi calls for a two-state solution to a conflict that continues to bedevil regional comity will be genuine or even possible. While Israel has been empowered to dodge this issue, the U.S. has played a more sinister role. It is the quotation at the bottom is from Aaron David Miller, who you may have seen on television and radio. He's on seemingly every day. He's a former negotiator for the United States in both Republican and Democratic administrations, and he wrote this in a Washington Post op-ed. He said, for far too long, many American officials involved in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, myself included, have acted as Israel's attorney, catering and coordinating with the Israelis at the expense of successful peace negotiations. If the United States wants to be an honest and effective broker on the Arab-Israeli issue, then surely it can have only one client, the pursuit of a solution that meets the needs and requirements of both sides, instead of just siding with one. So in conclusion, we could say that there's a choice to be made. There are many choices to be made, but the partnership can continue as is, in which we preserve the confinement of both the Palestinians under occupation, but the Israelis as well. The red sign on the right is something that you see when you go to what is called Area A in the occupied territories, which is governed both civilly and militarily by the Palestinians, at least nominally. And the sign says Israeli citizens should not go there. Your life is at risk if you go. So they are confined as well, although certainly not as much as the Palestinians, but it's still a life incomplete, not one of full potential. Or the partnership can change to encourage genuine emancipation and mutuality. It is true, we could say, that the Abraham Accords show that Jabotinski's Iron Wall has had some effect. The Arab countries are no longer busying themselves trying to destroy Israel and deny its existence. They recognize it's a reality, it's not going anywhere, and they're trying to figure out ways to partner with it. But the Iron Wall is still not being used as a tool of coexistence for the Palestinians. It's being used quite the opposite, to deny them, erase them, marginalize them, and if possible, remove them as much as can be done. And yet, until that issue is resolved, which is still the core issue of the region, violence can occur at any moment, as we saw on October 7th, and no hand is safe. The future remains uncertain. And whether or not the United States will make a change remains to be seen. It seems doubtful at this moment, but we have seen since October 7th something new, a social movement that has been born in the United States, where people are now looking at this issue with different lenses. And while it may take a long time, which would be too long for the people of the region, something may change down the road. Change sometimes takes a long time, and we may have seen the flowering of a beginning, but we'll have to wait and see. Apologies for taking so long. Thank you for waiting. If you have any questions, fire away.
Alan, this is going to be up on Case website?
Yes, yes.
Will it be available to be used elsewhere? This needs to be heard.
You can, make suggestions, we'll do it.
One suggestion I would make is that you put your name and a copyright on each slide. It's very easy to do. I can help you do that.
Okay.
Just like that.
My attorney.
Yeah, well, no, I would like to use it, but I would only do it if your name is appearing on every slide.
That's fine. I really don't care, but we can talk about it. Sure. I appreciate your concern, but born poor, stay poor, it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's fine. We can talk about it. I'm happy to share. Very happy to share. Knowledge should be free. Very happy.
breathtaking, Alan.
Thank you.
Maybe if we can, I know we're out of time, but if we can invite those on Zoom, if they would care to stay.
Yes,
for
of
a little
course,
longer.
of course,
Yeah.
of course. Do you see anything in the chat, Dean? Any-
People raise their hands, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Call
Thank
them.
you. Thank you.
While we do that, if I just may say thank you so much for this offering. It's like, it was just so incredible, and I could feel so much like infuriation, like building in my body about this history not being acknowledged and how it's brought to a head where we currently are. So I just want to say thank you so much for all of the labor you so obviously put into this and the thoughtfulness.
Thank
So
you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking
Yeah.
time to come.
I'm really happy.
Much
to be here.
appreciated.
Alan, if you can stop sharing so we can see those who have their.
Yeah, sorry.
hands raised.
Okay, now what can I do? Should I just click
Yeah,
out of
just
this?
Stop sharing, yeah.
So I did stop sharing. What else can I
Do we
do?
have, just invite them probably.
Yeah, okay. Would anyone watching on Zoom care to ask a question?
About 3 people.
Okay.
Just tell them to feel free.
Yeah, I've done that. Must be my intimidating sports jacket. Yes,
I'll ask a
what-
question in the interim here. I also just want to echo like the contextualization of all of this, the history, the framing, and seeing the relationships of these different groups is just, I have never heard this positioning before, and I just want to acknowledge that. I think it's a really helpful perspective. Part of what is difficult about any conversations when we talk about the Israel-Gaza conflict or any conflict that's happening right now with Israel is just so much, it's just so fraught with, you have Zionism, you have anti-Semitism, you have all these other things that are going on that make it difficult to have these conversations because people are like, well, why are we saying this, right? And I'm curious to hear your take, because when I hear the way that you frame this, it changes like how I think about it in a sense of like, it's not just about anti-Semitism or Zionism. There's so much more than just those two things, which clearly those things are very important. But there's a lot of other things that seem like they have shaped the situation we are in now. And that has not been spoken, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about I don't know, how we can have these conversations in a way that maybe doesn't, just so easy to people just point to anti-Semitism or Zionism or whatever it might be that isn't always the simple answer.
Sure. I mean, I think the key is to have a sense of history. If you have an awareness of history and you can speak factually with documentation, you can show how there's a project going on that has a particular narrative which has excluded certain realities, which people are simply not conversant in. And it's still hard to have discussions because people are frozen in their viewpoints, especially, I think, older generation Jewish people refuse to believe that Israel is anything other than a country that is victimized and is always under threat, rather than seeing it as I've depicted as a very strong player right from the beginning, even before the beginning. And looked at from that perspective, you get certain different conclusions. But it may be that those conversations can't be had because people are frozen in their points of view. And it's personal. I can, if I may, I'll just, if you have time, I'll just share with you an autobiographical little footnote that I remember as a kid. One of my earliest memories as a grade schooler was being accused by some of my classmates as killing Christ. I didn't even know who Christ was at the time. I found out, but I didn't know at the time. Many of my classmates were from the South, Arkansas, Alabama. They were just, speaking what their parents had told them and what their parents had told their parents. But, that kind of took me aback. And then I remember And I didn't have a lot of issues because, like my brother in the back, we played a lot of sports and we didn't have a lot of issues along those lines. We were just accepted as part of the gang. But I remember very distinctly, 1967 in June, during the Six-Day War, I was walking to my neighbor's house to pick him up to go to school. And the television was on and they were showing the war. And my friend's father said, wow, Israel is really tough. It's really pretty great. And that was like the first time someone had said something to me that was very positive about, me being Jewish or me being connected with Israel. And everything changed after that. People began to look at me differently just because I was somehow connected to this very strong, heroic state. Until I went to university and took a class in 1974, so it's the 50th year anniversary of this, with Neil Layton. Took a class on colonialism, another class on Middle East conflict, and I learned some of these things. And I realized I had a choice to make. I could either continue to feel good about myself, being proud of this country, or I could simply be real and be honest. And to me, it wasn't really much of a struggle. It just seemed like the right thing to do, and the evidence was compelling to me. But for others, it is. It's very threatening because they have a personal interest in their own identity, I think, in preserving this particular narrative. So I don't know. It's hard to have discussions. It's especially hard when the hegemonic frame is always look at Israel heroically. But I think that's changing, at least with young people. It's just the evidence now. I mean, the way people look at social media, they look at Eye on Palestine, they see it in real time, and they're appalled, as rightly so. And of course, it's complicated. I mean, Israel has points to make, but I think it's changing, or at least it could change. But as well, the backlash has been severe against university students. It's been, and you can tell what a threat those encampments were, and the attempt to change the narrative have been, because the backlash has been so severe. And that is still playing out. And we'll have to see how that ultimately prevails. It's still in process, I think. And what happened during the Democratic National Convention, when you had apartheid at the podium, when you can get someone represent the Palestinian viewpoint and even speak on the matter, even though they cleared or they previewed what they're going to say, that's just really pretty pathetic. But politics are still very real, and the country itself hasn't changed. But there's the germination, I think, of change. So I didn't really answer your question because I don't know what the answer is, but that's how I look at it. Jim.
Yeah, just to comment on that a little bit. Part of what I really appreciate is exactly what Mo's done.
So they can.
That's a good point.
So they can hear you.
No. Is you're framing this in a much broader way as not just about Israel, but it's about this country. And it's since particularly 1992, but going back to post-World War II, taking over the globe and wanting to maintain a particular kind of control. And yes, the oil in the Mideast is central to that. And I think that's absolutely critical. Two things out of what was just being said that I think are also important. One is this country is post-genocidal annihilation of our Palestinians, native Turtle Islanders who've been genocidally cleaned up from the bottom of Argentina to the top of Canada to the tune of 95%, between 62 and 145 million folk when Columbus landed. And they have effectively been eliminated. They are still here and still saying, by the way, you're on stolen land. By the way, what's going on in the Mideast is exactly what has gone on here. And so this country is totally invested at a deep emotional and mythic level in what Israel is doing, because it's us. And I think that's a deep thing. And the second piece is, as somebody who's been involved a little bit in this politically now and going to DC for various actions, the most recent of which in late July was trying to interrupt CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which is an organization that is 10 million people strong, bigger than any Jewish organization that is supporting Israel at this point in time, and linking it with the roots of Zionism in mid-19th century Christianity, and basically saying, this is how we provoke Jesus to come back, and then the Jews will be presented a choice. We don't really care about Jews. We just want Jesus here and the playing field to then be cleared. Yes, I think young people are responding on one hand, and I think November 5 is going to be a revelation of where things actually are with this. On the other hand, there's a lot of young people being gathered into the Christian Zionist nationalism, white nationalism camp, particularly males. Just an article this week, for the first time, Christianity in this country is in the process of becoming primarily male. A lot of the women are leaving, young women. A lot of young men are pulling into it because it's the only place they're finding any resonance. So I think this is going to be an ongoing, deep struggle that is not just about Israel, but about who the United States is.
Well said.
But I also see why what you presented, this breathtaking unpacking of the history, why that had to be excised out in the mainstream narrative. You don't find that. It's like everything started with October 7th. Right? Because it's necessary to erase that history so you don't have a context. You only see the spectacular violence of October 7th, but not the everyday violence, right? And all the violence that has led up to this point.
I agree. And
what I find so helpful in what you presented is the archive of direct quotations.
I'm glad you like that.
So amazing, and the civilizational.
I appreciate that you like that. Yeah, thank you. In terms of what Jim had to say, there is an affinity between the United States and Israel, and that both look at each other as a settler country, pioneers. So that is an important cultural affinity. And there's also this notion that there's a concern on, say, the liberal left, of reluctance to criticize Israel as the only Jewish state, a fear that this will provoke anti-Semitism. When I think it can be totally separated by simply talking historically about human rights, it should be sufficient. In terms of the area, I think we can say that even though the region one day may diminish in terms of being a source of hydrocarbons, it will remain important to the United States because there's so much capital there. The capital markets are enormous, the real estate markets are enormous, and the regimes there have these great ambitions to establish cutting edge technology like AI research facilities and such. So the US will continue to have an interest there, even though oil and gas may one day hopefully no longer be as important, but that region is not going away in terms of importance. So I agree. And then in terms of the Christian Zionists, and I read the same article you did, that's an important force. It's undeniable. And they are beyond, it seems, historical discourse. They simply do not want to hear. I don't know, I mean, I usually don't say that as a teacher. I have hope and expectation for anyone to be able to wrestle with facts and make reasonable conclusions, but they operate on a different plane for different purposes, as you say. So it's very hard, and it is growing. And it's not just there, but it has, as I said, Israel has this brand which has adherents all over the world. Part of the Israel likes to position itself as a traditionalist country, even though on the one hand it claims that we are friendly to gay people, we have gay parades, but at the same time, in the mainstream, there's a lot of traditionalism, and Israel plays that where it wants to with great effect, like in a place like Hungary, or even with Russia. So it's a very complicated place, and they're very adept at politics. They're very good at it. You in your presentation in March talked about Hasbara, to explain Israel is excellent at this, at least if you don't have any historical background, but excellent. If not, they sound very foolish, like any propagandist does. But they're very conscious of getting out their own message. They don't have, like the Palestinians, people speaking with accents. They sometimes get British people or American people to be their spokespersons, and they understand the audience that they're speaking to, and they do it well. They've been doing it for a long time. Yes, Hannah.
One thing I thought was so powerful was the connection that you made and the examples that you gave of like people who are simultaneously like Zionists and anti-Semites. And it made me think a lot about this current moment where like anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are being like so conflated. And so I guess just in general, wondering, navigating those types of conversations. And, you know, I know people who hold a lot of positions of power within different institutions that we're in that even think that ceasefire is anti-Semitic because it deems that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself or exist, as you kind of named that like obsession with that its right to exist. So, yeah, just I know you named like really being factually aware and like having some of these examples, but just curious on you know that topic in general, navigating the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
So the question is how to navigate the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I mean, it's to say that it's to make plain that anti-Semitism is about hating Jews for being Jews. It's essentializing Jewish people. Where Zionism, to me, is a different kettle of fish. It's a political ideology, a project. It has nothing to do with religion. I mean, Joe Biden calls himself a Zionist, right? He's Catholic. So it doesn't require that you be Jewish. But of course, the ideology is about Jewish nationalism, essentially. But it's not the same thing as being a Jewish person. I do not identify as a Zionist. I am, if anything, an anti-Zionist. I'm not a practicing Jew. But if you call me a dirty word, somehow something gets stirred up in me and I get animated and I feel Jewish again. But I can make the distinction between the two because one is political, one is religious. Even though the one that's political involves a certain people who share a particular religion, but it's not about the faith. It's about a project, a nationalist project to implant a particular people in a land where they were not there and another people already occupied it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I look at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
everything you shared was so helpful in navigating that. Sorry.
No, that's it. That's it.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Do you want to take a question from the chat?
Of course.
So go ahead and unmute if you have a question in the chat.
I just wanted to make a comment. First of all, thank you, Alan, for this talk. It was excellent, and your quotations were incredibly illuminating. One part that I haven't thought enough about, but that you brought to the foray here is the role that Israel plays to perform interventionary actions that the U.S. sees as being politically unpalatable. So you referenced the support for Pinochet, the support for the South African apartheid regime, and many other instances. And I'm just curious what you think about this in the present moment, as, I mean, right after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, Joe Biden was reported, it was reported that he was upset, right, with Netanyahu for going behind the Americans' back. He was also said yesterday or 2 days ago that it's time for a ceasefire, something he usually doesn't say. I'm wondering if, there is a way in which privately the United States is happy that Israel is acting in this manner right now, backing Iran into a corner, decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah, and fighting or taking on the so-called axis of resistance in the region?
Yeah, I'm just guessing. It's a great question, Adam, and thanks for attending. I think if we have to look at states as not necessarily having a unified point of view. I think there are people in the military who are ecstatic about this, who are very happy to see Iran indirectly weakened and discredited, and to see their pals in Israel prevailing. But I think there are others, perhaps in the State Department, who look more askance at this and realize we're really, on the one hand, teetering on the brink of something much more consequential and catastrophic, but also in the end, since the US on the one hand is always talking about ceasefire and truce, and then seeing this denied by their Israeli proxy, it's like the tail wagging the dog. It makes the US look weak and silly, or at least it makes the president look weak and silly. And I think this is the perception that they're very concerned about, but they've so tied themselves in a box to be committed to Israel and Israel's right to defend itself that they're unable to move in another direction. Whereas I said, other presidents have not hesitated. Again, Reagan did it multiple times. But of course, it's a different time as well because Israel is now better able to defy US wishes if it wants to. And there's also the special case of Netanyahu, who is somewhat of a political guru and a Houdini, and understands America better than most, better than many American politicians. So I'm conflicted about how to understand this myself. I think there's a division. Some are very happy about it, like the arms industry, they're quite happy, more orders for them. But I think there are others who realize that in the long run, this is not working out well, and that it makes the US look weak and very ineffective. And arguably, some also see that Israel is acting suicidally. The only solution they have seems to be more and more coercion. They're being criticized at home by not having any sort of plan for the long run. And it seems like Netanyahu doesn't feel he needs one. He can just bludgeon people, and that's sufficient. And he can tell the Israelis, look, I've killed Nasrallah. Maybe I'll create a cordon sanitaire in southern Lebanon. That'll be great. And maybe that's good for his political future. But I think the Americans are somewhat divided on this, and they have no apparent strategy to deal with the Israeli intransigence. And it certainly is intransigence. At the same time, I'm sure they like the fact that Iran looks also weak. But they may worry that at some point they also have their breaking point, and they may have to have some kind of response. But I don't know. I don't know. It's a great question.
Just to amplify that, what do you think about what China and Russia are thinking in relationship to this development as having some growing relationship with Iran?
So the question is, what does China and Russia think about what's been going on?
And how does that factor in? That if Israel pushes too far, does that pull China and Russia into Iran's background confronting the US?
So what does this mean for Russia and China with respect to Iran? And I guess I would say, I think Russia is worried that Iran will be drawn into war because Iran is now an important supplier of weapons and drones for Russia. And if Iran has to fight a war, or they're destroyed substantially, or even more, I think, which is the Iranian concern, they are overthrown by people who are unhappy with them, then they lose an ally in that way. In terms of China, I think China is happy to see the US twist. As long as the US is preoccupied in the region, it means it has less wherewithal to contest China in its region. So I think they're happy to see the US bogged down. And it's been a magic bullet for them for now over 25 years, right? Ever since the first Iraq war, basically. So I think they're pleased with that. They won't be pleased if it suddenly begins to affect oil supply, on which they're still dependent. They have major contracts with Iran and others. They would not like to see that disrupted, or the Houthis get more active in their interdicting oil containers. But otherwise, I think they're happy to see the U.S. Have a problem. They don't care. That's fine. And as well, just to add one more thought, the Global South is so, I think, unified on this matter. It plays into China's hand as a self-appointed leader of the Global South, showing the U.S. is just heartless, that they have no conscience. We offer a better path for an interdependent, multipolar world. So we offer a better kind of leadership in a world that is not led by the United States. I think that's also very important for them.
You can go on and on, right? But thank
Okay.
you so much, Alan.
Thank you. I think we're going to wrap it up, Adam. Thank you all for attending on Zoom. I appreciate it. We'll be back on the 19th.